Is there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere or sometime along an indefinable line between the reasonable and highly unlikely? Makeshift Stories presents a monthly journey into the improbable.
Today's story 203, Escape from Haven, Part 2. Read by Mitchel Tew. Audio post-production by Matthew Erdmann. Somewhere and sometime, we might discover what appears on the surface to be opposites might, in fact, be two halves of the same thing. After curbing his anger, Karl left the park, found a clothing store, and distracted the proprietor long enough to surreptitiously lift a coat with a hood. He wasn't sure how tightly things were monitored in hinterland, but suspected tracking was a lot more prevalent than its citizens were led to believe. The so-called attendants, aka prison guards, he had befriended in Haven, hinted surveillance beyond the island had been abandoned generations ago. There was no need for it, they claimed. Surveillance was a pointless artifact from the dark pre-exile days. But this was exactly what Karl would say to a population when he in fact wanted to keep tabs on them. You make them feel safe, then monitor every twitch. Misdirection was a powerful tool. He wasn't a fool. He could see the cameras still crowning the lampposts. No one had taken them down, and there was a reason for that omission. There would be other so-called unused monitoring systems as well. And that was why he didn't risk using Hamilton's credit twice, and instead stole the coat from a rack out of sight of the store's allegedly unused cameras. Yeah, sure they're turned off. He laughed to himself as he quickly left before the proprietor came back from the storeroom. The footage of him in the store would be recorded somewhere, but there would be no reason to look at it. He was counting on the generally lax attitude of residents here to result in a sloppy inventory which would hide the theft. Finding Melissa, the attendant he had blackmailed into smuggling the organic replicator, wasn't that hard. Free public terminals were almost as common as the hanging flower pots decorating the main streets. Was use of the terminals monitored? Of course, they had to be. Why else would they be free? But he had to take the risk. He had angled the coat's hood to hide his face. If they eventually ID'd him, it wouldn't matter once he had the new skin, so he didn't care if he led them to his hapless conspirator. He just needed a few hours' head start. Hiding under the hood, he made his way through the clean and tidy streets of the port. The city was as surprising to him as the park. The lemmings, at least that is how Karl thought of the locals, had a keen sense of aesthetics which almost matched his own. He had grown up believing only the elites of Haven valued qualities beyond utilitarian function. So, by the time he found Melissa's home in a pleasant treed side street not far from the main market, he wasn't surprised to find she lived in a picture-perfect but modest, like everything else in hinterland, cottage, placed in the middle of a well-tended garden, surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The gate complained with a shrill screech as he opened it, announcing his presence before he could make it to the front door. "Who's there?" The voice came from the garden. Karl didn't immediately recognize Melissa. Her hair was pulled back under a broad-brimmed hat, and she was wearing loose-fitting, dirt-covered overalls, which hid the shape of her body, making her appear much broader than she was. She held a gloved hand up to shade her eyes. "Hamilton? Is that you? What brings you here? I thought you were headed back to Haven for another shift." "I was rescheduled." Karl tried to play along, not wanting to reveal himself outside. But Melissa stiffened at the sound of his voice. "It's you, isn't it?" she accused, with more than a hint of anxiety. "Look, I played my part. I don't want anything to do with you now." Karl stepped closer, forcing Melissa back. we should talk about this inside. Unless you want your neighbors to overhear. Melissa nodded, then carefully stepped around Karl, well out of arm's reach, and headed to the front door. Come on, then, she directed, trying to sound in control of the situation. The inside of the house was something Karl, up to last week, would have dismissed as extremely pedestrian. However, now knowing the opulence he had lived in on Haven was simply an elaborate stage set to hide the prison bars, he could almost appreciate the quaint, working-class banality of the room he found himself standing in. At least the woman owned it. Then, he had an odd thought. Was Hinterland also a prison, just papered over by a thin veneer of... He had to stop and think about it. A thin veneer of civility, that was it. He was sure underneath he would find the familiar smell of power. Melissa turned to face him, arms folded across her chest defensively. I should call the inspector or port security. She tried to sound defiant, but the quiver in her voice said otherwise. Don't make me laugh. You won't call them, because you know I'll implicate you. I'll tell them how you helped me. I'll tell them how you agreed to smuggle the organic replicator. I suspect the authorities here don't appreciate acts of treason. Aren't traitors still punished the same way they've always been? You'd be made an example of to dissuade anyone else who might be tempted. What would that look like? Maybe public humiliation, then banishment, or worse. Do you really want to find out? Okay, Melissa finally conceded. I did what you asked. Now, get out. I don't want to see you again. Besides, I took the other one back to the hospital. She lied, hoping he'd leave. After having a change of heart, she had intended to return the replicator, but hadn't had the opportunity yet. Did you think I wouldn't be able to find you? Karl growled menacingly. Is that why you didn't leave the second organic replicator at the park? Did you think you could just walk away from our arrangement? Melissa didn't answer. She looked nervously around for a way to escape. Karl enjoyed making her feel uncomfortable. She, like everyone else in Hinterland, needed to learn their place in the natural order of things. He was an apex predator, and people like Melissa were just tools to be manipulated. He stepped forward, forcing the woman into a corner. They'll eventually figure out you are wearing a skin suit, Melissa nervously pointed out. That's why you agreed to provide a second device. Now, where is it? Karl demanded, closing in on her until she could smell his breath. Melissa hesitated. You'll just disappear into the population, right? That's what you said you'd do. You said you were desperate to see the rest of the world, that you'd die if you couldn't leave Haven. I felt sorry for you. You'll just become one of us. That's what you said. Melissa had always wanted to help others. It was the core of who she was. When not drafted into service as a Haven attendant, she worked at 2 local hospitals, looking after long-term patients, making them as comfortable as possible. Only after returning from her community service shift had she started to suspect her almost obsessive predilection to help others had been exploited by this man. She had originally believed she was helping an unhappy person who desperately wanted to be part of the broader world. Yes, she had been warned he was at the high end of the sociopathic spectrum, but that hadn't been enough to stop her from bending the rules. Instead, over time, she had revealed what Haven really was and what life beyond the enclave looked like. Then, one day, far too late to deny what she had done, he turned on her, threatening to expose her indiscretions. She just hoped he'd keep his word, but now, facing him in her home, she knew he wouldn't. Sure, that's what I said. I'll just vanish, Karl confirmed with little conviction. But to accomplish that, Melissa, I need another skin, one not associated with anyone who's worked on Haven. Melissa just wanted this to be over, so reluctantly she turned, pulled open a drawer in her dining room hutch, then handed Karl a package. He smiled. "That's more like it, but I need more, and I'm counting on you. Remember, if I get caught, you go down with me." He turned and left, slamming the front door behind him. Melissa sighed with relief, but knew it wasn't over. Karl would have preferred to use a room in Melissa's house for the transformation. It would take about 6 hours to grow the new skin, but he couldn't afford to have the diminutive woman see his new identity, or have someone who could be tracked back to his life on Haven suddenly disappear. He needed a clean break, so, for the first time in his life, he would sleep outside, in a hollow some kids had carved out in the middle of a dense thicket of lilacs. The ground was cold, damp, and uncomfortable, but Karl would walk out the next morning a new person, totally disconnected from his past. The temporary inconvenience was worth one night of discomfort, one night in exchange for an opportunity to bend this new world to his will. Karl curled up on the lumpy ground, trying to position himself as comfortably as he could, then pushed the microcard with the skin cells he had collected at the fruit stand into the replicator's sample port, pressed the device against his neck, and pulled the trigger. Gwen found herself in Odessa's office, feeling more like a rabbit than a hunter. It wasn't her fault, at least as far as she was concerned. The Haven escapee hadn't been found. Port security had given her almost nothing to go on, a video of a skin, which by now the escapee, if they had any sense, would have abandoned soon after they had used Hamilton's credit at the fruit stand. At least, that is what she would have done. But one thing bothered her. Why would someone as smart as a Haven detainee risk exposing themselves for a bag of peaches? It just didn't make sense. Gwen was rolling this outlier over in her mind when Odessa from Port Security interrupted her. "So, the trail went cold at the fruit stand," Odessa stated rather than questioned. "Did he say anything to the owner that would hint at where he was going next?" "No," Gwen confirmed, feeling defensive. She hadn't created the situation. Security had let the imposter through. It seemed unfair that now it appeared to be her problem. "You've seen the vid from the booth. We're lucky she had it on. Not many people do these days. There's nothing helpful on it, and the public CCD system has been off for decades. It's a dead end." "That won't happen again," Odessa noted as she slid in behind her desk. "I've been authorized to re-enable public surveillance. I also have a list of attendants who would have access to organic replicators. They're stored at hospitals with burn units. There are only 4 in the port region, and 6 attendants who work or volunteer at them. It has to be one of the 6 who provided the replicator. Before you ask, all 6 recently did public service in Haven." "Have they done an inventory? That would speed things up." "Working on it, Gwen. Again, record keeping has become slack in the last few decades, so don't hold out too much hope there. They will all probably show missing replicators if they have an inventory at all," Odessa informed her, leaning back in her chair. "Is it really necessary to reboot the old network?" Gwen questioned. "I didn't think the system had been used since Haven was secured. Does it even work?" She felt this was overkill. He was just one person. What could one person do? Besides, they would find him eventually without the intrusive public censor net. The network of cameras, microphones, sensors, and AIs which monitored them were artifacts of the pre-exile world. Assuming the system would never be used again, she, like everyone else, had never questioned why the infrastructure had been left in place. Everyone assumed it was simply a reminder, a symbol of what had been overcome. "The systems have been kept operative, Gwen. They're a last resort for situations like this," Odessa carefully explained, as if the council was simply extending the number of hours streetlights were switched on. "We can't afford to let even one of them get back into the general population. One is enough to wreck everything we've created. I've already fed the AIs the general weight and height of the escapee. They'll track anyone within a couple of percentage points. He can change skins, but he can't change his height and build. The system will watch for aberrant behavior in the matching group. I'll feed you names as they come up. Gwen grimaced, hoping she'd catch up to the escapee before she was required to drag in innocent people simply because of their physical stature and behavior. Here is the list of attendants who had access to replicators. Odessa touched a screen embedded in her desk. Gwen's wristcom buzzed, acknowledging receipt of the names. She got lucky on her third interview. A woman named Melissa, like the previous two attendants, claimed she hadn't removed any replicators from the local medical centers she worked at. Gwen knew right away she was lying. The woman was too nervous and avoided her gaze. The room monitors showed elevated heart rate and blood pressure. The euphemistically named interaction room, decked out with soft, comfy chairs and art, replete with aromatherapy options for the interviewee, was in fact infected with cameras and sensors fed into a pre-Haven behavioral analysis AI. Gwen hadn't known facilities like this still existed. How often did you interact with Hamilton? Gwen read from the script she'd been given, glancing down at the flex screen Odessa had insisted she use. We worked for different families, Melissa tentatively offered. I think I met him once. He was a server at a party for Haven business leaders. You were a chauffeur for the Walton family on your last 2 tours of Haven. That seems odd considering you're a caregiver and usually most attendants only work 1 tour with a family. Melissa squirmed. Gwen didn't need the AI to know she was hitting a nerve. I like driving, and no one else wanted the role. The Waltons can be hard to deal with. She hesitated. I requested the second placement. Really? You like being a servant for a demeaning family? Gwen questioned skeptically. Most attendants hate the humiliation of being treated like a zero. I know it helps us remember the reason for Haven. That's partially the point of public service, but... Melissa shrugged. I like driving. There's not much opportunity to do that in Hinterland. It's all automated now. Okay. Was there any other reason you wanted a second shift? Maybe you got to know a specific family member? It's happened before. Some of them can be very charming, Melissa. Gwen noted a message on the flex screen from Odessa, which said she was sending a request to Haven to do a head count of the Waltons. Figuring the machine had enough data, she skipped a few questions in the script and went right to the point. There are several organic replicators missing from local hospitals. You work at 2 of them. I didn't take them, Melissa burst out, kneading her hands. You didn't what? Think it would hurt to give 1 to a close friend? You were just trying to help, right? We all want to do that. I understand, Melissa. It could happen to anyone. Melissa stiffened, then buried her head in her hands. He said he'd harm himself if he couldn't get off the island. He said he wasn't like the rest. He'll just disappear, live a normal life. What's the harm in that? Are we so sure every last one of them is a dangerous sociopath? The door of the inquiry room opened suddenly, and Odessa walked in. I think we have enough, Gwen. I can take it from here. But I've got more questions. Gwen began to protest. We have his name now, Gwen. You need to follow up on distant relatives in Hinterland who don't have the marker. He'll eventually be forced to go to ground, and he'll need resources to do that. There's no more you can learn here, and the next thing Melissa will need is the help of a counselor. Karl was stiff and sore from spending the night on the ground when he woke. It was something he promised himself never to do again. The light of the morning sun spidered through the leaves of the lilacs, casting an animated patchwork of light on the earth around the small hollow he'd crawled into. The new skin suit was a bit tighter than the last. He didn't really understand how the technology worked. Was the new skin trying to force his body into the shape of the man he had sampled at the fruit stand? Despite the discomfort, he had managed to make a break with his past. They would eventually figure out who the patsy was, but Melissa would not know who he had become. Briefly, he almost felt sorry for the native hinterlander, like one does after tricking a pet into doing something it normally wouldn't do. Despite its pretentious assertions, he instinctively knew the world was still the same fertile ground begging for exploitation. Conveniently, it was apparently leaderless, and he would fill that gap. Karl straightened his clothes, walked out of the lilac bramble, and turned on the charm, reeling in the first group of early morning walkers he met. Gwen, still miffed by her abruptly truncated interview with Melissa, asked her wristcom to connect with the woman. Her investigation into Karl Walton's distant hinterland relatives had led nowhere. As the inspector designate, she had the right to interview whomever she wanted. She didn't need Port Security's consent. She had checked the regulations. Gwen watched the icon on her wrist screen chase its tail until it returned an error. Contact does not exist. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported.
To listen to other great APN podcasts, head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com and check out Emily Missed Out. Emily and Brianne take in pop culture-filled movie classics that Emily has never seen but should have. Or check out The Read Along, a mini book club for your ears. You can find both and more at albertapodcastnetwork.com. Today's story was brought to you by the Calgary Foundation. Whether it's funding anti-racism programs, addiction recovery, or food hampers for the hungry, for 65 years, Calgary Foundation has proudly supported the charitable community to address some of Calgary's biggest challenges. Now, during this period of unprecedented urgent needs, Calgary Foundation renewed its commitment to building a healthy, vibrant, giving, caring, and resilient community. If you're a registered charity looking for a grant, a professional advisor creating a giving plan for your client, or a donor wanting to give back to the community, discover a wealth of resources at calgaryfoundation.org and learn more about their work through Calgary Foundation's Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
Makeshift Stories is released twice a month around the 1st and the 15th. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchel Tew. Audio post-production by Matthew Erdmann. Opening and closing themes were composed and recorded by David Hume. To find out more about David, head over to davidhume.me. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or any of your favorite podcast services. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution no derivative license, which means you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.